Okay, so biogeochemical cycles, starting with the phosphorus cycle, our natural levels of phosphorus are relatively low, and that's super important for our cycle as we move forward. Organisms in our phosphorus cycle can only obtain phosphorus one way, and that is through the water that plants uptake. So, whether it be the plant that is making the carbohydrates that something eats, or something eating that something that ate the plant, however many steps removed, our phosphorus in all of that can only enter the food chain through those plants, right? It's the only way we can get phosphorus in our diets is through what we eat. And through water we drink, if that water has phosphorus in it. The wants of consumers, wastes of consumers. Goodness gracious. Sorry, y'all. I promise I've proofread these. The wastes of consumers contain phosphorus that is returned to the soil. So, the natural life processes create wastes. Those wastes sometimes contain phosphorus. That phosphorus is returned to the soil through decomposers. Remember, a decomposer is an organism that lives in soils, that breaks down the either dead material or the waste material from plants. So we're thinking like earthworms, bacteria, fungi, stuff like that, that breaks down decaying matter. That is a way that phosphorus can be released into the soil, which can then mix with water and get uptaken by plants. So that's kind of our small little phosphorus cycle. Questions so far? Doing okay? All right. Make sure everybody's got the time correct. So this is a majority of the phosphorus cycle. We keep the levels relatively low. There's not a lot going on with it. We can impact the phosphorus cycles in a lot of ways. We as humans can change this natural phosphorus cycle. So we mine phosphorus for fertilizer. So phosphorus helps plants grow. If we want to help plants grow, we will mine phosphorus out of the ground and we will turn it into fertilizer. These also, there is nitrogen in our wastes, whether that be our food wastes or our wastes, and that water, wastewater, gets removed from businesses and houses through like sewer systems and stuff. And because phosphorus is also really, really common in cleaning detergents, so like hand soap, laundry soap, all that fun stuff, phosphorus is pretty common in there. That phosphorus will also get added to the water system, the wastewater system. So not only the phosphorus in our wastes, but the phosphorus in our soaps can enter the phosphorus cycle through these wastewaters. And then our fertilizer runoff can be added into like natural waterways. And can leach into the ground and affect groundwater that way. So whether it be our wastewater from us and our cleaning habits, or the wastewater from fertilizers, both of them, if they wind up in natural waterways, can increase the amount of phosphorus in those waterways, which can be pretty detrimental, and we'll talk about why in a second. So these are the ways that humans can impact the phosphorus cycle. We are really good at adding phosphorus where it wasn't originally, especially if we want a lot of plants to feed a lot of people, right? Feeding people is good. We want to feed people, and one of the ways that we do that is through fertilizers, because fertilizers help plants grow, people eat. But there are some downsides to being able to do this, and that downside is impacting the phosphorus cycle. Ooh, sorry, no, you're fine. Thank you. Awesome. All right. Whew. Questions, comments, concerns? All right. This process, this negative downside that I talked about. Oh, you need me to go back? So we can impact the phosphorus cycle. When the phosphorus cycle changes, it can lead to some pretty dramatic downsides. And one of those downsides is what we are going to talk about on the next slide, and also what all day tomorrow is going to be. So our activity tomorrow is about eutrophication. Eutrophication. The addition of phosphorus, so adding phosphorus to a body of water, can lead to a process called eutrophication. In eutrophication, we have an overgrowth of marine producers. So algae and phytoplankton, all the little photosynthetic bugs. If there's a lot of phosphorus in the water, a lot of these can grow. Like a lot of these can grow. So we've got a bunch of this overgrowth, and we call that eutrophication. Now, when we have a lot of algae, we're going to have a lot of dead algae. It doesn't last forever, so there will be layers of that dead algae that sink to the bottom of whatever water system we're in. In that case, our decomposers are going to break down the dead producers. They're going to break down the algae that has died. When decomposers break down our dead producers, they use oxygen, because oxygen is a big part of the decomposition process. So we got all of these decomposers decomposing a lot of these producers, and it sucks all of the oxygen out of the water. And if it sucks all of the oxygen out of the water, it can lead to something called hypoxia. When we've got widespread hypoxia, it can lead to something called a dead zone. And we'll talk about some of the big dead zones tomorrow. But how many of you, show of hands, have ever been driving down the road, or maybe your family, or maybe you have a pond nearby, and that pond is just coated with a layer of green? Have you ever seen that? Yeah? That is eutrophication. It's really common around here because we've got a lot. Was that a question? Or just okay. It's really common around here because we've got a really big agricultural community, right? A lot of agriculture, a lot of fertilizer, a lot of phosphorus, a lot of algae. So if you were to drive past a golf course, a lot of times golf courses are dealing or handling eutrophication a lot, because they use stuff to make sure the grass is nice and green. But it will kind of leach that phosphorus into the water, and then we get that kind of gross greenish scum. So eutrophication, we've got lots of phosphorus. This leads to lots of producers. This is usually algae. If we've got a lot of producers living, a lot of those producers are going to die. So we've got lots of dead algae. Because only so much can grow at one time. If we've got that, then we have a lot of decomposition. If we've got a lot of decomposition, that can lead to a very little oxygen. And if we've got no oxygen in the water, that can create a dead zone. Another way this usually happens is with oil spills. So there's actually a really big a really big dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico because oil spills have increased the amount of phosphorus because there is phosphorus naturally occurring in crude oil. A lot of that oil leaches into the water. That's a lot of phosphorus. A lot of phosphorus, a lot of producers, a lot of algae, a lot of dead algae, a lot of dead algae, a lot of decomposition, no oxygen. And when the water doesn't have oxygen, our producers are going to die. And the things that eat the producers, so the fish that eat the algae, are going to die. And then the big fish that eat the little fish are going to die. And we won't be able to fish anymore. And the birds that eat the fish are going to die because they don't have any food anymore. And it'll throw off the entire food chain. So this process can be really, really dangerous. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the fish aren't dying because they have a disease. The fish are dying because they don't have anything to eat. So if we did find fish, they'd probably just be skinny because they didn't have anything to eat. So it won't hurt us physically, but it'll hurt us financially because the entire fishing industry is going to be impacted. So I've got this kind of example, as you can see here. Like all of this area around the coast is just coated in this green covering. We've got a kind of mucked up one, and then, I feel like it'd be interesting to touch, but not necessarily the most cleanly thing. But this is the process of eutrophication. So we've got the phosphorus cycle. So I've got our little pictures because the little pictures are fun and important. And I figure you don't want to draw out the whole cycle, huh? So let me get these out to you and we'll do this one together. There we go. There you are. Uh-oh. There you go. Little bitty phosphorus cycles. All right. All right. Did I forget anybody? Okay. So here we go. We're going to start with our runoffs from fertilizer. So runoff from fertilizer. Right? That fertilizer has a lot of phosphorus in it, and that's how that phosphorus gets into our waterways. We also have our naturally occurring phosphorus in rainwater. So we've got precipitation. Some of the water cycle in there. I told you that the water cycle would be coming back. This one down here we didn't really talk about with our phosphorus cycle, but we did with our carbon cycle. So as our phosphate groups enter water systems, sometimes they will sediment onto the bottom. They'll just all settle down here. So we've got sediment deposits. And that sediment deposit will just put it into rocks, right? Rocks, over time, more pressure, more solid, whatever. We have to either mine it or wait for a geological process to bring those rocks up to the surface. So, geologic process, uptake. Or uplift. We'll go uplift. All of the sediments on the bottom of the water through whatever processes that may be, either mining or like volcanoes and tectonic plates and all that fun stuff, is going to lift all of our phosphorus reserves from the bottom. This right here is also runoff. So, we've got our underground phosphate reserve, so the phosphorus in water underground, or just the phosphorus in the ground. Our plants are going to take in phosphorus through water. So take in phosphorus through water. And then consumers are going to eat those plants. Consumers eat producers. Then after our plants and animals die, we have decomposers. Our decomposers are going to return phosphorus to soil. So decomposers return phosphorus to soil. Yes. If it's an absolute emergency. If not, I'd prefer to get through the notes. All right, then we got one more. And this is going to be erosion. Slowly breaking down phosphorus reserves in the water, or in the rock, and making its way into waterways. Notice phosphorus was never in its gaseous form. Yeah. Phosphorus was never a gas. Our atmosphere is not a part of our phosphorus cycle. The biosphere, yes, because we've got living things. The hydrosphere, because it's in precipitation in water, and the geosphere, because we're in the rock, but never the atmosphere. Questions about our phosphorus cycle? All right. Oh, one backwards. Into the nitrogen cycle then. So, the nitrogen cycle is another one of our biogeochemical cycles. And our nitrogen cycle typically relies on bacteria to make nitrogen useful for living organisms. So, our nitrogen cycle is really, really, really dependent on bacteria. We'll talk about what those bacteria do in a moment. So, nitrogen is super, super, super abundant. Nitrogen makes up 78% of our atmosphere by mass. So 78 of the mass of the atmosphere is nitrogen. It is the sixth most abundant element on Earth. Nitrogen is everywhere. It holds a very vital importance in all of life's processes. Sorry. Oh no. If not, I'm so sorry if you have to watch this video. So nitrogen, super, super important to life. If we remember our macromolecules, both DNA and RNA and our nucleic acids have nitrogen in them, and proteins have nitrogen in them. And proteins are super duper important for literally all life's processes. Those enzymes carry out the chemical reactions in our bodies that make us work. So nitrogen is super, super important. Despite nitrogen's abundance in the atmosphere, it's not super easy for nitrogen gas to cycle out of the atmosphere and into the organism. So even though most of the air we breathe in is nitrogen, our bodies can't use that nitrogen gas, so we just breathe it right back out. It's not like the water cycle where our water vapor will condense and be in a usable form. We have to actually do something to nitrogen in order for us to be able to use it. So, because of this, nitrogen is super scarce in the lithosphere, hydrosphere, and in organisms. So, super abundant in the atmosphere, not super prominent in all of the other spheres. Because it likes to hang out as nitrogen gas, but nitrogen gas isn't super useful for us. Super abundant in the atmosphere, not so abundant in our lives and in the geosphere because it likes to hang out as gas and it doesn't want to do much else. We just started the nitrogen cycle. All right, so nitrogen super abundant outside or in the atmosphere, not super abundant anywhere else. So nitrogen gas. Nitrogen is a diatom, which just means that it likes to hang out in groups of two. So like oxygen gas likes to stay as O2. Nitrogen gas likes to stay as N2, which just likes to have a buddy. So N2 is nitrogen gas. So nitrogen can become usable to organisms. It's just a very, very rare process. Nitrogen has to undergo a chemical change. This can happen in three ways. Three ways nitrogen can get out of the atmosphere: lightning strikes, special bacteria, or human technology we developed right before World War One. Three ways. We can take nitrogen gas and make it into something that we can use. Special bacteria can, and lightning strikes can. Those are the three ways nitrogen gets from the atmosphere to the biosphere. These compounds act as fertilizers, right? We need nitrogen to grow. Therefore, plants that we need to grow so we can feed people also need nitrogen. So, lightning, bacteria, human technology can take nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere. And only when it is out of the atmosphere can we use it for things that we need it for, like fertilizers. We get the nitrogen we need from the things that we eat. Typically, it's not an issue. Proteins. Protein has nitrogen. and pass these out ahead of time while we're writing stuff down. So we can get this nitrogen outside of the atmosphere in these three ways. And we're going to focus mainly on the bacteria one, just because it's the one that happens the most commonly, the most naturally, but we'll touch upon the others. Did I forget anybody? Okay. So, nitrogen cycle. Like I said, it has to be usable to organisms, and the way it becomes usable to organisms is through a process called nitrogen fixation. In order for nitrogen gas to become usable, it has to be fixed. And you only need these two lines. You already got this on the last slide. So just those first two lines, that in order for it to become usable, it has to be fixed. And that nitrogen fixation is the conversion of nitrogen gas into ammonia. Ammonia is a more usable source of nitrogen or form of nitrogen than nitrogen gas. Naturally, this can happen two ways. One is the intense energy of a lightning strike. Honestly, I'm not sure how that one works. The chemistry is pretty intense. And the other way is when the top layer of soil, the bacteria in that top layer of soil, is exposed to the air, and they can take in that air and fix that nitrogen, or the bacteria can fix that nitrogen into ammonia through a bunch of chemical processes that those bacteria are able to do. So this is nitrogen fixation. And again, you only need these first two lines. You don't need to write the rest down because all of that was on the last slide. So nitrogen fixation is going from nitrogen gas into ammonia. Questions, comments, concerns? All right. So the third way is through, like I said, human interactions. That wasn't developed until World War I. So nitrogen fixing bacteria live freely in soil, so they can just be floating around down there. But they are also strongly associated with certain plants, like soybeans, clover, and other legumes. And what they do is they live on the roots of these plants. And as they live on the roots of these plants, they fix the nitrogen for them, and those plants use the nitrogen byproducts of these bacteria for free, essentially. So all of these little yellow dots free floating in the soil, as well as these on our roots, that is where our nitrogen fixing bacteria live. That is partially one of the reasons why we alternate corn and soybeans, like in fields, because soybeans have a lot of nitrogen fixing bacteria associated with them. Nitrogen fixing bacteria like soybeans. So in the years where we have soybeans planted in fields, it will increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil so that the corn the next year can use it, and then back and forth and back and forth. We'll talk a lot about crop rotation when we talk about soil resources in our resource unit next semester. So, these are where our nitrogen fixing bacteria live. So I'm gonna highlight this one. I know it's kind of wordy. So there are other types of bacteria that will use ammonium and perform nitrification. So nitrification is the process where ammonium ions are turned into nitrate ions and then nitrate ions. Nitrate ions are like the preferred way for individuals to uptake nitrogen. So nitrifying bacteria take the ammonium from the nitrogen fixing bacteria. They will give it to the other organisms around. The other organisms around will perform the process of nitrification, where our ammonium ions are converted into nitrate ions and then into nitrate ions, and plants can uptake the nitrate ions. Nitrate ions are what plants prefer to take in. And then our cycle is complete when denitrifying bacteria will convert the nitrates in the soil or water back into nitrogen gas. So nitrogen can get released back into the atmosphere through denitrifying bacteria. So there's a lot of bacteria involved in the nitrogen cycle. A lot of bacteria involved in the nitrogen cycle through the process of nitrification and denitrification. So, what happens is our nitrogen fixing bacteria will take the nitrogen gas out of the air and they will turn it into ammonium. Then, nitrifying bacteria will take that ammonium and turn it into nitrate. Plants will uptake that nitrate, use it. Consumers will eat those plants, get the nitrogen they need that way. And then when those consumers die, denitrifying bacteria will take the nitrates in the soil from decomposition and turn it back into nitrogen gas where it is released into the atmosphere again. Do we have questions about the nitrogen cycle? All right. There's the definitions of nitrification and denitrification. So, humans! Humans can mess a lot of stuff up, and they can do this by fixing nitrogen themselves. And we discovered this shortly before World War I. What this allowed us to do was overcome the limits of plant productivity imposed by nitrogen. So, the amount of nitrogen in the soil, the amount of nutrients in the soil in general, determines how well the plants can grow. So, if we can add all of this stuff into the soil, our plants will grow better. So, when we were able to fix nitrogen chemically and put it into fertilizers, we were able to grow more food and feed more people, which is, really, really important. We love to feed people. So today, human beings process just as much nitrogen, if not more nitrogen, than happens naturally. So we have kind of overtaken the typical rates of nitrogen fixation. And there is some controversy about how much we do this, and there are some limits set in place by certain regulations. And we might go into that on Monday, but that's not necessarily what today's about. So these are the human impacts of, or how humans impact the nitrogen cycle. got it. All right. So, these are our cons. Nothing too crazy. We literally just this last line. Taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere can lead to acid precipitation. So, acid rain is our big con here. When we fix nitrogen, we increase its flow out of the atmosphere. We kind of got that with our last slide. We can also affect it in other ways when we burn forests, fields, and burn fossil fuels. Because if we take plants out of the earth, right, that means we are removing the way that nitrogen gets into the biosphere. And we increase the amount of nitrogen dioxide in the atmosphere, and this can lead to acid precipitation. So literally just this last line, that's all you need. That's your big con for all of this nitrogen fixation. All right. Here's our nitrogen cycle. Are we ready? All right. So up here at the top, we have nitrogen in the atmosphere. That is as nitrogen gas, or N2. So up at the top, you're going to write nitrogen in the atmosphere, or N2. The way that nitrogen gets out of the atmosphere is through nitrogen fixing bacteria in soils or on roots. So you could just say on roots. Nitrogen fixing bacteria on roots. Or nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil. Those are our two ways: our free floating nitrogen bacteria and our not so free floating nitrogen bacteria. These bacteria and the process of ammonification, which is just decomposing, making ammonia, increases the amount of ammonium in the soil. So we've got ammonium. Then we've got more of our fun little bacterias. We've got our nitrifying bacteria. Our nitrifying bacteria carrying out the process of nitrification, which will turn our ammonium into nitrites and nitrates. And once we have our nitrates, two things can happen. The first is if denitrifying bacteria get a hold of it. If denitrifying bacteria get a hold of it, it'll go back into the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. Or it could get uptaken by plants through a process called assimilation, which is just uptake. Just plants sucking up the nitrogen from the soil. Then our plants will take it up, use it. Our little gopher buddy right here, who I think is absolutely adorable, is going to eat the plants. And then, unfortunately, if our little gopher buddy dies, decomposers. So you just really need decomposers. We'll take this process, take the dead material, and turn it into ammonium. So we've got kind of a loop within a loop here. Do we have any questions, comments, or concerns about the nitrogen cycle? I'll give you a second to knock that out. Assimilation or uptake. You can just write uptake if that's. I'm going to pass out the glue sticks for those of you who want to keep these in your notebooks. That way we don't lose them. tomorrow we will talk about eutrophication. And then on Monday, we will probably hit either some real life application y stuff, or we will talk about the other nutrients that we mentioned, like calcium and potassium and iron, and how those cycle through our atmosphere. Anyone have any questions?